Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the With Chinese Characteristics podcast. I'm Natalie.
I'm Cherry.
And together we talk about topics with Chinese characteristics. So, Cherry, what's our topic for today?
Our topic for today is the largest lynching in American history.
Okay. How does that have Chinese characteristics?
Well, it was the 1871 Chinese massacre in Los Angeles, California.
Was it Chinese massacring people or was it...
Massacre of Chinese people. And this was the biggest group lynching in American history.
How many people were lynched?
15. And the total victim of the entire event was 19.
Wow, okay.
This particular historical topic was on our wish list for the episode we want to do one day of the rise of rice. How do you say it?
Rise, not rice.
I moved it up because of the rise.
There you go. Good job. You made it through it.
Of anti-Asian hate crimes.
Because of coronavirus. Or not because of, but...
With the excuse of.
Yeah.
COVID-19 in America, particularly.
Yeah.
So this feels like an appropriate time to revisit history. In the very first episode of our podcast, if you've been with us ever since, thank you very much. The first episode we did was on the Pigtail Ordinance. We talked about the history of legislated racism against Chinese Americans in San Francisco in the late 19th century. You know, it was a tough world on immigrants.
Well, yeah, I mean, when you pass a law called the Chinese Exclusion Act, it's not too secret what you're trying to do.
No.
But, you know, that wasn't lynchings, right? I mean, that was legal stuff, which doesn't necessarily make it better because it can still be just as bad, but it was how do we get from...
It actually happened around the same time, specifically 1871. Anti-Asian, anti-Chinese racism was on the rise.
When Hoa Ko was getting his queue shaved off in jail.
Yeah, up north in San Francisco. However, before getting into the details of today's episode, I want to introduce another podcast that I'm a big fan of. They are doing an episode addressing anti-Asian violence in the United States recently. They're called, at the moment, Asian American News, a podcast where the term Asian American is explored as an identity and a political movement. I enjoyed this podcast very much, and I found it refreshing and essential in the world we live in today. You can find their link in our show notes. Let's hear from them.
Hey there, I'm John Ray Serapio.
And I'm Sylvia Pong.
We're the hosts of At the Moment, an Asian American news podcast.
Every other Tuesday, John Ray and I tackle the everyday politics that shape Asian American communities.
At the Moment is produced by AZ Media, an independent Asian American news media organization founded by Zillennial Asian American journalists and storytellers.
You can find our podcast at www.azi.media.
Or look up At the Moment Asian American News on Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen.
Check us out and see you on Tuesday.
(1871), Los Angeles, California, was the Wild West. The total population was about 5,800 people, and about 200 of them were ethnically Chinese.
Okay.
At the same time in San Francisco, the population was about 150,000.
Wow, okay. So San Francisco was a real city. Okay, and Los Angeles was those towns you drive by that on the freeway that just has a gas station.
And instead of me describing it, someone who has not lived through that time, I thought I should just read you this by John A. Lewis, editor of the Los Angeles Star in 1853. He wrote, "There is no country where nature is more lavish of her exuberant fullness. And yet, with all our natural beauties and advantages, there is no country where human life is of so little account. Men hack one another into pieces with pistols and other cutlery as if God's image were of no more worth than the life of 1 or 2 or 3,000 ownerless dogs that prowl about our streets and make night hideous."
I feel like that's a little dramatic because the Taiping Rebellion was going on right now in China, and millions of people are dying a year.
But there's only 6,000 people in LA.
It's a little bit different when you all know each other. If it's a small town and you're all murdering each other, that's a little bit different.
Yeah. So later on, LA reinvented itself to be a sunny travel destination, and a real estate boom helped it to move on from its Wild West past.
Okay.
However, before that happened, especially during the several decades after the end of the Mexican War, which was 1848, Los Angeles was a rough place. Murder, gun violence, and dead bodies in the street was almost a daily occurrence. And amongst the 200 Chinese in town, 80% of them were male. That's the same as, majority of the Chinese population in America at this time was male because they were hired to work on the railways and they came here to work in the gold mines.
And they couldn't become citizens, so the intent was that they'd be here temporarily, right?
Yes,
So don't bring your family,
And one day in October in Los Angeles, a fight between two local Chinese gangs broke out. And when I say Chinese gang, I don't know if that's 100% accurate, but for the lack of a better word, they're actually Chinese tongues. The word tongue means hall or gathering place. And Chinese tongues are a thing of secret society or sworn brotherhoods, but basically most of the time a blend of community organization and mafia for organized crime.
Closer probably to the mafia than to like the Crips and the Bloods.
Yes. The history of Chinese tongues is a complicated one. In California, during and after the gold rush, Chinese immigrants and workers faced a lot of hostility from labor unions, sometimes from the general public, sometimes from law enforcement themselves.
Well, we talked about the anti-Kulu laws and stuff in the first episode.
Yeah.
Because there's all sorts of jobs that Chinese people could not do.
So people organized for support and for protection. The tongues provide that for the community. They assist in employment and housing opportunities for new immigrants. They resolve disputes within the community. And a lot of the times they act as sort of a neighborhood protection force around Chinatowns. It was also pretty common for these Chinese tongues to operate gambling houses and prostitution for financial gain.
And it's also probably, if you're a young Chinese guy who arrives in Los Angeles, you probably didn't have a choice of joining the tongs or not, right? Safety in numbers.
Exactly. So this day, two rival tongues in Los Angeles fought over a woman. Some sources I could find say that she was a sex worker, which was pretty likely considering that that's the business these Chinese tongues were in. But the bottom line is that they were fighting over the ownership of this Chinese woman because, women were properties back then. Some were still in the world today.
It's not about love. It's as an economic unit.
Yes.
This woman can provide some sort of service.
Yes.
Okay.
Apparently, the local police would sometimes hunt down and capture escaped women and return them back to Chinese tongues. Of course, with payment and bribery.
Okay. It's like a fugitive slave law over here.
Exactly. On this date, the conflict escalated and there was a gunfight in the Chinese neighborhood in town. The location would be present-day Los Angeles Street near Union Station and right in front of the Chinese American Museum. If you live in Los Angeles.
Chinatown today is pretty close to Union.
Actually, the old Chinatown had to move because the land was assigned to the Union Station and a lot of Chinese residents were displaced. Back in those frontier days, half of this neighborhood would be lined with gambling dens and brothels. And, it's rough. And on this day, gunshots between two Chinese tongues were exchanged. No one got injured, but one shooter, who was a member of one of the Chinese tongues, were arrested. He was then brought to court and the bail was set at $2,000, which adjusted with inflation today would be $41,000.
Okay, so that's a crap load of money.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah.
However, to everyone's surprise, the tongue leader showed up to post bail. And the court couldn't believe that he had that much money. So a policeman accompanied the tongue leader, whose name is Sam Yuan, who was also a shopkeeper, to his store. Sam Yuan showed the police his little fortune, and the police was able to verify that Yuan indeed had the bail money and a lot more. So the arrestee was bailed out, and only if the story just ended there.
It's interesting, though, that kind of shows how rough Los Angeles was, that you have an active shooting and then you just let somebody go the same day, right? It'd be like if I got in a shootout in a Walmart parking lot and the police are like, well, you paid bail, stay out of trouble.
Right. Well, I will say, though, they set the bail so high, expecting that no one would be able to bail him out.
Well, especially probably because they think oh, these Chinese immigrants don't have any money. I mean, they're probably like, we wouldn't be able to pay that, right? And we're white, so how are they going to pay it?
Yeah. So but that's not the end of the story, obviously. The next day, another gunfight broke out between the same two companies. Same conflict. The thing's not over. And somehow this time, the same police officer who got to witness the small fortune of the Chinese shop owner was just in the neighborhood, got immediately involved and tried to stop the gunfight. Several citizens nearby also took it upon themselves to join him and other police. The policeman was shot and died soon, and then one of the bystanders, named Robert Thompson, who joined the gunfight and chased Chinese gang members into a building, also got shot and died soon after.
Okay.
So what happened after that was, very quickly, word spread that the Chinese were murdering whites.
When really 2 white people walked into a gunfight.
Well, one of the policemen, I guess, tried to stop the gunfight officially. But yeah, the other one was a
Bystander?
who wanted to be a hero.
Okay.
So a mob of around 500 people gathered very quickly. And just to remind
It's
you,
like 1 in 10 people.
the entire town's population was less than 6,000. So that's a lot of people.
Yeah.
And they gathered in this neighborhood to lay siege to the Chinese. Among the group was then LA City Councilman George E. Fall. As the mob surrounded the neighborhood, Marshal Francis Baker, who was also the city's dog catcher and tax collector, lots of big jobs for him, set up the premise and ordered his men to shoot any Chinese who tried to escape. When I read that they set up the premise, I thought, oh, good, they're trying to, stop the mobs from coming in. It's the opposite. So,
want to make sure that the Chinese people are still there for the mob to get.
Exactly. So mobs gathered. They chased a group of Chinese into a building, but in fear of being shot like the volunteer cop before them, no one marched in. But eventually they climbed onto the roof of the building and used pickaxes to break the tar ceiling and make holes, then sprayed gunshots from atop. The Chinese trapped in the building gave up pretty soon after that. Then, one by one, they got dragged through the fields. They were beaten, they were kicked, stabbed, some shot to death and got their bodies hung up. Some were dragged through the streets with ropes around their necks and then lynched over a sidewalk. Among the victims was a 14-year-old Chinese boy. Among the mobs, a boy not over 10 years old stood at the lynching site, described by the reporting of New York Times at the time. He was as active as anyone in doing the hanging. His childish voice sounded strange at the time and place, and he called aloud for more victims. And it was a stranger and sadder sight to behold him lay his hands to the rope and help to haul them up. So eventually...
So it was a community event.
It was a community event. Eventually, 15 corpses dangled in the city of Los Angeles. 4 others died from gunshot wounds, therefore bringing the death toll to 19. And that's the 10% of city's Chinese population.
So
murdered
really,
by the other 10% of the rest of the city. Really.
So really, I guess, so 15 were quote unquote lynched, right? But I mean, really it's kind of 19 because the 4 people, and that's not counting the 2 white people who got shot, right?
No.
So it was a violent day.
The tragedy didn't end there. The Los Angeles Daily Star and New York Times both reported what the neighborhood looked like after the mobs had gone through it. Every nook and corner, every trunk, chest, and drawer in every apartment was being carefully and expeditiously ransacked. Locks gave way to the pressure brought to bear against them. Every article of value passed into the hands of the pillagers.
That kind of makes me think of probably the most infamous, the Black Wall Street race riot on the East Coast. Yeah, Tulsa race riot where, post-Civil War, black...
It's not just the lives they're taking. They also want your wealth.
No, I mean, and sometimes they just want the wealth, really.
Well, but murder is a way to get there.
Yeah, and if you're dead, then you can't complain about it, right?
So not only the houses were robbed, it is stated that the pockets of the captured were robbed whilst dangling from the improvised gallows. One of the victims, Dr. Jin Tang, who was a well-respected figure in the community, the only Chinese physician in Los Angeles at the time, as he was getting dragged through the field by the mobs, he begged for his life, offered his diamond wedding ring and cash payment in exchange of some mercy. He was shot through the head and then hand. His finger was cut off so the mobs could obtain the ring easily. The estimated number, anywhere between $14,000 to $30,000 that had been carried away. And $14,000 in 1871 would be more than $300,000 today. So some history researchers propose that given how rare the presence of law enforcement was in this neighborhood on any other given day, the very reason why the police was so close and nearby and acted so swiftly was that they had planned to rob the Chinese towns of their wealth that they saw the day before.
I mean, in the modern day, it's called civil asset forfeiture, where police can basically, in a lot of states, just take property if they think it could be used in a crime, right?
Yeah.
So you think
and that's legal.
Yeah.
Right?
But this was obviously illegal, but some people suspect that they saw the bail money cash, and they're like, yeah, these people are loaded.
Yeah, let's get fat on that.
Yeah.
So whether that was the true intention of the police and the mobs were not, because obviously they're not going to admit to it, but we can't prove that. But on that day, which was October 24th, 1871.
Well, they certainly didn't leave the money behind.
No, the Chinese community of Los Angeles was robbed completely.
So people who weren't involved also got robbed.
Yeah. The whole neighborhood got robbed.
Yeah, and it's basically like you're if you tried to stop them, the mob would kill you. So you might as well just let them take all your stuff.
So they were robbed of their lives, their homes, their possessions, and their rights of being treated like a human being. After all the murdering, lynching, torturing, and pillaging, the satisfied mob dispersed around 9:30 p.m. that evening, and an eyewitness counted, at 11 o'clock, one would have scarcely believed that such fearful scenes were taking place in the city only 2 short hours before. So quiet and deserted were its streets. And I read that and I was like, because maybe to the city, this is just another day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, and obviously I think nobody was worried because obviously the police were there kind of in on it. So
yeah,
nobody really felt like they'd done anything wrong.
No. In the coming days, 8 people were convicted of manslaughter at trial and sentenced to prison anywhere between 2 to 9 years. Their sentences varied. However, their convictions were overturned on appeal due to a legal technicality. And I looked up what that was.
Well, I'm surprised they even got... Well, I mean, see, California is kind of strange, and also Texas to an extent, because Texas was slave. It was on the Confederacy. California was technically on the Union, but it wasn't really. It didn't do much in the war.
Yeah.
So for a while, it was kind of a wash-up racially, whether it was going to be more like the South, where people get lynched and they don't get in trouble, or if it was going to have more like rule of law.
Yeah.
So I'm surprised that they even got charged.
Yeah. Well, you know how the city of Los Angeles looked like nothing had happened?
Yeah.
The East Coast, people were shocked and outraged, at least on paper. New York Times wrote this long article and detailing the event. And people would be calling Los Angeles, land of heathens, and it sort of played into the image that California had at the time, where it was uncivilized compared to the East Coast, and how it was the Wild West, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, there was some people were shocked, just on the other end of the country.
Yeah, I mean, and I felt like when we were doing the Pigtail Ordinance episode, New York Times and other papers were fairly sympathetic to the Chinese people involved.
Yeah. Oh, to be fair, I found some articles from Los Angeles Daily Star. That was...
Guys, that was pretty screwed up what we did yesterday.
Right, no, exactly. Okay, let's not laugh. There's no laughing.
I mean, but it's 5,000 people, right? I mean,
know.
like the paper is like,
yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like going to be one guy in a printing press. Like,
I know. Back to the technicality.
He was probably there.
Yes. So basically, the technicality was the DA or whatever they call them back in the days, right? Did not properly file.
Was he the dog catcher too?
Right, the dog catcher, the tax collector, the marshal,
and the DA.
Yeah. he did not properly, I don't think it's the same person. I think
Okay.
that they had a name, I read it, and it's not the same person. But he did not properly file the paper to prove the death of certain victims. I think Dr. Jean Tong was one of them, even though clearly these people were dead, as
Yeah,
you see them hanging there. And,
Yeah.
So this was the technicality. The government did not pursue the case again, even though they could have refiled it.
Yeah.
This was seen as a, quote, rookie mistake, leading to the suspicion that it
A
was
quote
intentional.
unquote mistake. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So with that, most of these mobs clearly operated with impunity on their mind.
Yeah. They
Right?
knew they were going to be fine.
Yeah. And they did not expect anything to happen to them. For that, in their
Well, they
mind,
expected they were going to make some money.
they were not committing a murder or a crime. In addition, let me bring light to some other legal histories. We love legislative drama, apparently, on this podcast. An act concerning crimes and punishments passed by California State Assembly in 1950 had stated that no black or mixed race, it was a different,
Not 1950, 1850.
1850,
I
sorry.
was say 1950. I'm like,
Yeah, no, you're right, 1850.
if it's talking about black and mixed race, I'm like, that doesn't sound like.
I know. It stated that no black or mixed race, it was a different word back then, but I don't want to say it, person or Indian shall be allowed to give evidence in favor of or against a white man.
You don't want to say Chinaman? No. But,
As written, the section did not appear to apply to Chinese witnesses.
okay.
So this was 1850. And also, in favor of or against a white man. White woman, I guess that's okay. You can testify against them.
Well, you can't. I mean, sure, they're women. They're not going to commit crimes. They're too dainty and delicate.
Oh, are we?
Yeah.
In 1853, a California court convicted George Hall, a white man, of the murder of Lin Xing, a Chinese minor, based on the testimony of 3 Chinese witnesses. George Hall appealed the verdict, arguing that the testimony of the Chinese witness should not be accepted and that the section 394 of the Act concerning civil cases, which barred the use of testimony of black or mixed race person or Indians to testify against white people, that law, that terrible law, should also be extended to banning the testimony of Chinese.
So he's just like, yeah, that Chinese guy, he just took my gun and shot himself 5 times. And
Yeah, also, you know what? Like these discriminated groups,
yeah.
let's add more to the group. We're not discriminating against enough people.
Well, I mean, you're acting like you're joking, but I mean, they literally.
No, I'm not joking.
Yeah.
That's literally what they're saying.
That's literally what they're doing.
saying these people are getting fucked over. Excuse my language. Let's fuck more people over.
There's always this.
Yeah.
There's the kind of the saying today where it's like, oh, you're not supposed to say the quiet part out loud. Where if people are, doing like dog whistle racism, or they're doing things like,
Yeah.
they're not supposed to say what they actually think. But I mean, back
This is
then,
they're saying this.
Yeah, what they.
And guess what? The California Supreme Court agreed. So this was the famous case, People versus Hall.
Mm-hmm. So basically, if
Yeah.
you're a Chinese person, you got murdered, unless there's a white person, a white guy, willing to vouch for you.
Yeah, that's it. That's it for you. So,
Make some white friends, everybody.
and how could that not be seen as an invitation to violence against racial minorities and a signal to say, this is open season,
Yeah.
right? So, with that case, that law in mind, it's not hard to understand why these mobs, 500 or so people, all thought they could get away with it. And indeed they did.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the event itself. There's a few interesting things I want to talk about that I thought of as I was researching the case. One is how lynching is an all-American tradition,
Yeah.
right? That's fair to say, right? Some people might not like it, but it is. I found some stats from NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. From 1882 to 1968, 4,743 lynchings occurred in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Of these people that were lynched, 73% were black people. And even though 4,700 seems like a large number, it's well known that not all the lynchings were even recorded.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of the thing that gets left out, is the fear, because it's if you're a person of color or, in certain periods of time, Irish or Latino or Chinese, if a group of white people decides to harm you or rob you or do something to you, and you resist in any way, they're just gonna kill you. And if anybody else in the community tries to resist, right, then it's gonna become a race riot.
Interestingly, because there were white people, a good number of white people that
Yeah.
was lynched. Many of them were lynched for helping the black or being anti-lynching. And sometimes they're lynched for domestic crimes. But
I can imagine, like, if you testified against a white person because a black person or an Asian person couldn't testify, right, they just might lynch you.
yeah, right. So in the South, not in California, lynching was a popular way of resolving some of the anger that the white people had in relation to the end of the slavery. And most of the lynching that took place happened in the South after the Civil War. And once...
Well, there's no need to do it before the Civil War.
Well,
They're
exactly.
property.
Yes. And it's crazy.
Yeah. There's a Pulitzer Prize winning book I like. It's called Slavery by Another Name. And another reason why was because the 14th Amendment, which one ends slavery?
It's not the 14th.
I think it's the 13th Amendment ends slavery. But it has a caveat in there, and it says, except in case of imprisonment for a crime. So,
Oh, God.
So basically, you could still have slaves as long as they were accused of some crime.
You capture them as a criminal.
So basically, one of the reasons behind all the Jim Crow laws is because to have all these trumped up charges, and you can grab anybody walking through town and put them in the coal mines or whatever,
Right.
and it's technically legal. So
You can't see me, but I'm shaking my head.
yeah, so there's economic reasons for it too. It's not just
Yeah.
racism and anger.
And of the lynching that was happening in the South. But of the lynching that did not take place in the South, mainly in the West, the lynching was normally happening to white people. And in this case, the Chinese. But really, there weren't that many Chinese, in all of America and California, even though the white people, really hated them, thought they had such a big impact. But really, it's a drop in the bucket.
So obviously this was a huge deal, right? The New York Times wrote about it. But, I mean, were lynchings that common in California?
Mostly, majority of them were happening in the South. That's the most common. And not that much happening in the North. A good number happened in California. And there is this book called Hanging Trees, The Untold Story of Lynching in California. It's kind of shocking because in those frontier days, what's special about lynching in California is that California has a lot of just space, vast space, right?
Well, it did.
And a relatively shorter history than New England.
Doesn't really anymore.
It still does have a lot of
does,
space. Yeah.
Not in LA.
One thing about recording the history of lynching in California, where researchers try to map the location and try to identify the history of lynching, a lot of times it's really hard because it's not like there's a building somewhere. If there's a building, you can mark it on the map. A lot of times there's just nothing, and it's a dead tree. And
they'll just say we strung them up on the old tree by the Henderson farm or something.
Yes, but it's hard to record, and it's hard to have a memorial and to establish an institution to write into textbooks. So in a way, the history is also lost there, and people don't get the heinous crimes don't get proper recognition.
And also California, I think, doesn't feel the need to broadcast the fact that it had a lot of lynchings too.
I mean, who would?
Yeah.
But it's important to remember history and before it repeats itself, right?
Yeah.
Lynching as an all-American tradition, it was a powerful tool of racism and hate crimes.
Yeah.
That it was used to practice racism, to practice hate crime.
Yeah, but it's also kind of romanticized, right? I mean, romanticized by communities as this kind of like vigilante justice thing.
Obviously in this case, the lynching was motivated by racism as well, right? But lynching of the white people of private crimes or domestic crimes, and it's a way to get back at people. And that goes back to the whole romanticism of the Wild West, of the Western movies that was made by Hollywood, and how this is such a nice idea to have freedom, or the best way to take down a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun.
Or a whole town with guns.
Or a whole town with guns, right? And you
ropes.
have bodies in the street every day.
Yeah.
very romantic idea of a society that I certainly want to live in. I'm being sarcastic. So at the same time then, lynching was also used as a method of vigilantism.
Yeah.
And vigilantism's definition, it is law enforcement undertaken without legal authority by a self-appointed group of people. So in this case, it was the citizen mob, it was the volunteer cop, and it was everyone who did lynching everywhere. Because it's not a legal execution, but sometimes they pretend that it is. Sometimes they will do a mock trial under the tree, and they will say, so-and-so, you're guilty, and here you go.
Yeah, and I think if you probably asked the people doing the lynching, they'd go, these Chinese gangs, they're out of control.
Yeah.
Like, they're shooting people in the street. We got to stop them, right?
Yeah.
And then it's like,
we got to take it upon ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's not really what it's about, because then they would just arrest the people and take their guns away or something. They wouldn't. They wouldn't kill 20 of them and
well, apparently
rob
only
everyone.
one of them was involved in the shooting of the 2 white people.
Yeah.
So this reminds me of a recent case that's very, very recent. So a lot has happened in 2020, right? We're now in 2021.
Well, I just want to say though, so so the vast majority of people, so basically all 200 people in the town, Chinese people in town, were involved in some way, right? Because they all got robbed.
Mm-hmm.
They all probably got beaten up too.
Yeah.
But even the 20 people who got dragged out and hung, probably, very few of them, if any.
One of them,
right, had anything to do with the events, the previous, or the shooting.
Yeah.
And even then, right, that's not the proper way to deal with it.
No.
It's just to murder everybody in the
you
street.
can't do that, no, right? Yeah. We'll say that though. All of Los Angeles at the time, they had 6 official police.
Mm-hmm.
And vigilantism was a thing. I don't think it should be a thing, but that's the reality of what a Wild West is. Yeah. Right? So, not to hate on Western movies, but the reality of these romanticized, it's not really a society, it's a frontier, right?
Yeah. Everybody was probably armed.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah.
But I don't want to go back to that, so maybe some people do. I don't know. So, back to vigilantism. These mobs were self-appointed as law enforcement. It reminds me of a case that's very recent. So a lot has happened in 2020. I think it was an awakening for a lot of people and for, I guess, society at large. And one of those cases that shocked everyone was the murder of Ahmaud Arbery. On February 23rd, 2020, Arbery, an unarmed 25-year-old black man, was pursued and fatally shot while jogging in Georgia, the state of America. Arbery had been pursued by 3 white residents in town who were armed, and they were driving a pickup truck. And one of the suspects told the police that himself didn't know if Arbery had stolen anything or not, but he had a gut feeling that Arbery had committed break-ins in the neighborhood.
Mm.
And if that's not the definition of, quote, vigilantism under the cover of racism and hate crimes, I don't know what is. And also what happened in this case is that he was murdered and nothing had happened for months. For a good few months, right? And one of the 3 men who was chasing him, he had a video actually that he shot.
No, it was he thought it would exonerate them.
Yeah, he did. Yeah,
no,
right.
He thought it would make them prove that they were innocent, right? Mm-hmm. They basically drove trucks, forced him off the road, and shot him.
Yes. So, but that video had surfaced a month after the actual murder.
Yeah.
And without that video, this would have just probably gone away.
Well, the famous
just like
case,
the murder of all these Chinese citizens, back in 1871.
Well, Trayvon Martin is the kind of, and George Zimmerman is the kind of predecessor to that, where there was no video, and he just he just chased down a black guy and shot him, and said, "Oh, once I confronted him, he came at me, right, and then I shot him."
Yeah.
But
it's their words against no one's words.
So what are you getting, like that? Chinese Americans are in the same boat, have a shared experience.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah, because I think today, I think that a lot of Chinese immigrants, maybe not like for 2nd generation or 3rd generation, they view themselves as
model minorities.
Model minority and not really discriminated against, right? Or like that they're better than that.
Model minority is a form of racism.
It is, right?
Yeah.
But the problem is, right, it's like that can switch in an instant, which is what you kind of mentioned at the start, how these violence attacks are up against, hate crimes are up against Asian people, right? Like you are in the same boat, right? If there's hardcore racists, you're in the same boat as black guy jogging,
every other
right?
minority,
every other minority who gets discriminated against.
Yeah. I mean, this concept has been discussed. I mean, it sounds like we're just talking about cliches, right? It's like first they came for so-and-so and then they came for so-and-so and I haven't said anything and they came for me and then no one's saying anything for, I'm repeating something that everyone has heard many times. And, or the concept of injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. And, in this case, racial discrimination anywhere is racial discrimination against anyone at any time. It's not your turn yet. Yeah. Right?
And in the example here, like, for example, Akhmat Armory, as far as I know, didn't do anything to anyone, right?
No.
But obviously the lynching in 1871, these people weren't angels, right? They're not perfect, but that doesn't mean...
You mean the Chinese gang?
The Chinese gang, right?
Yeah, no one's perfect.
No, right. That doesn't mean they deserve, and certainly all the people who had nothing to do with it, who got killed around it, or got robbed and beaten up.
Criminals have rights.
And white people have the luxury where a white person can murder someone in a town, and the town doesn't kill every white person.
No.
They don't go, these white people are out of control.
No.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the history of Asian Americans and the history of black people in this country. There
is no hierarchy of pain or suffering. Intersectionalism, I think, is important and worth thinking about.
Gotta have love for each other.
Right? And the interesting thing, another thing that is, of these 500 people, eyewitness account had mentioned that they were a group of white and Mexican people based on, the language they were speaking. Mexicans back then were counted as white.
Yes.
Right?
Technically,
yeah.
Yeah.
And, these white people, they're all from the same country. They're all loosely Europeans, right?
Yeah.
And they have bonded together.
Just looking around the room and seeing who else has white skin, quote unquote white skin. I mean,
pale skin.
European.
Yes, right. And French people aren't the same as German people, but in America, they're all the same. They're all Americans. And they think, in a way, sometimes that only themselves are Americans.
Yeah.
Right? These Chinese immigrants
Well, these Chinese people weren't American. They've been legally prevented from becoming American.
History has a way of repeating itself.
Yeah.
And recently, anti-Asian racism and hate crimes is under the spotlight. A bit late, but at least it's, we're here.
150 years too late.
I know, right? But at least we're talking about it and it's getting traction. And there is a lot of aid from other communities as well. And a way to avoid history from repeating itself. What would happen after this lynching that everyone just got a slap on the wrist? Right, and then what happened to Arbery? That his case would, if not because of the video, also just a slap on the wrist.
So that was kind of heavy.
Yeah.
But it is good to kind of see the other side, because I do think we might have run the risk of in the Pigtail Ordinance of making things seem a little too civil, right?
It's all just fond of lawsuits and legislation.
And it's like, and
legal tricks.
Somebody got their hair cut off, right? Which is obviously very traumatic for the person involved.
But it's not a lynching. I'm sorry, again, there's no hierarchy of suffering.
I know, but it's not a mass lynching. Yeah. And obviously this was the big one, but I'm sure it's definitely not the only one, right?
Yes. But, there is hope. We're talking about it today. The recent light.
I mean, there is hope, Cherry.
I don't know. I'm just trying to. This is a very dark episode. And it was very depressing to research about this. But
there is no more Chinese Exclusion Act.
There is no. Yeah. And the recent light that's shed on the hate crimes against Asian Americans.
Did you see that there's community groups that have been organizing to
Yeah.
walk old Chinese grandmas to the
Yes.
store to do their shopping?
It's very cute. Yeah.
So they don't get beat up.
Yes. Love that. And we should talk about it more. Everyone should talk about it more.
Yeah.
And, progress can only come from that.
Yeah.
So
Well, thanks for listening, everyone.
check out At the Moment, Asian American News.
Yeah.
We'll leave a link in our show notes down below. If you enjoyed our show, you will enjoy their show too.
And our next episode should be a little bit less heavy. We're gonna do another movie reviews.
Is that what we're doing?
We're gonna do Tiger Mountain.
Not Sing Sun?
No, we'll Sonia Sun after that.
Okay. All right.
Have a nice day,
No,
everyone.
I want us to leave us a comment and all that.
Oh,
No.
Say that. Okay.
Well, if you made it here to the end of the episode, thank you for...
This is Cherry hustling here, trying to get people to leave us comments.
Well, please leave us a comment on Apple Podcasts. We would love to hear from you.
Rate us on Apple Podcasts if you like us. If you don't like us, don't rate it.
No, they can still rate it.
No, don't rate it.
Thank you for listening.
Minimum 4. If it's a 3, don't rate us.
Keep your opinion to yourself.
Your opinion to yourself.
No, we want to hear from you. And if you want to see previous episodes and all that, we have a website. It's withchinesecharacteristics.com. You can look at show notes from previous podcasts. You can download them. You can recommend us to your friend if you enjoyed this episode.
They've never heard of a podcast before. Well, everyone, have a nice day. Do all that stuff that Cherry said.
See you next time.
Bye.